Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com, How to Make an American Flag Themed Patriotic Bowie Knife, Part 2. Now on Part 1 of this series, we went through making the actual blade, grinding the bevels, etching the stars onto the blade, heat treating, tempering, and basically getting the blade ready to add the brass bolsters and the scales. I actually made two of these knives, and I kind of goofed up a little bit, and I actually filmed the second knife, which has the carved brass bolsters and the walnut hybrid scales. I did not film the one with the karbix red, white, and blue handles because I've done similar videos in the past. I did a whole video on using that red, white, and blue karbix product. But I goofed a little bit because the alumalite, which was my first time using it to create the blue on the hybrid scales, didn't come out to my satisfaction. But anyway, we're going to go through the process. So after the blade is done and heat treated and the blade is etched with the stars, I carved brass bolsters. I buy 1/4 inch brass stock, 1/4 inch by 1 inch brass stock. I leave the one edge flat. That's going to go against the scales. You can carve the other sides. You can carve the front to any design that you want, and the top and the bottom usually are ground to match the actual blade outline. This is attached with 2-part epoxy and 1/8 brass pins. Once they're both in position, I'll put a clamp on those and walk away until that's dry. I'll also put a link. I have a whole link on doing brass bolsters, or a whole video on doing brass bolsters. I'll put a link right up on this video. They really do enhance knives. It's just a neat thing to be able to do, is adding brass bolsters to your knives. Adds a little bit of class to them. After the glue is dried, you do want to grind down the pins just so that they just stick up a little bit, and then I peen those over for some additional security. You just don't want any way of those things popping free. And that peening process kind of wedges those brass pins outward, makes them wider, and they really become secure. Now, this is the prototype or proof of concept knife that I made. It's a little skinner. Also did it with that American flag theme, and I made these alumalite blue sections. It's a casting resin, and I cast into the alumalite some white vinyl stars. I pressed those onto a blue felt and cast them, and they came out beautiful. Then I tried to make it. I figured I won't use the blue felt. I'll use blue liner material. Did the exact same process, and I ended up with an opaque light blue end result. So I wasn't happy with that. The third attempt, I went back to the felt, and all of my vinyl stars lifted partially off the felt so that they weren't sitting flat. The fourth attempt, I decided to use a blue paper, construction paper, and that worked pretty good. The stars are all flat, but the paper didn't stay sunk in the middle of the mold. So both ends lifted up. And later on, I didn't realize it was going to cause a problem, but later on, when I was grinding these things off, you can see this is the bottom of my mold wasn't completely flat. So I had to go over to my belt sander and sand away the bottom of this alumalite until it was flat. And in doing so, I partially ground away a couple of the vinyl stars from the bottom. From the top, basically the same problem. Because that paper didn't stay on the bottom of my mold, parts of it lifted up. Those vinyl stars were a little bit too close to the surface, and they got ground away while I was forming the handles. So anyway, the end result, the knife came out decent, but I'm just not thrilled with the blue portion or the alumalite portion. I'll definitely do these knives again, and I'll just figure out a better way of getting those stars embedded into the alumalite. But anyway, we're going to continue. So what I've done here is I've got a piece of blue liner material. I've coated it with 2-part epoxy. I'm laying this on a flat piece of glass coated with parchment paper so it doesn't stick. I've got a piece of wood on one side just to act as a stop, and I'm going to put my alumalite, which I cut it on an angle just for looks. And then after the alumalite, or in between the alumalite and the walnut, I'm going to add red, white, and blue spacers. This is just liner material. Again, coating both sides with the 2-part epoxy. That's all in position. I'm going to add epoxy now to the bottom of the walnut. This is walnut which we ripped down to, I believe it was just about 1/4 inch thick. I'm also going to cut that leading edge, or the edge that's going to be in contact with the spacers. And then the hardest part of this process is once you put the walnut down, you really want to push it firmly up against the alumalite and the liners, but you can't press too hard, otherwise those red, white, and blue spacers will kind of get pushed out of that space. So it's a balancing act. You want to get all of the material in contact with the walnut and the spacers and the alumalite with no gaps. And then I just use a weight. I'm just using a paving stone. Once everything's in position and those liners are pressed down, I just put a paving stone in position, and it seemed to work. After it dries, this is what you end up with. I'm going to go over to my belt sander, and I'm just going to clean up 2 edges. And that way I can go to a chop saw and I can chop an angle onto this to match up with my brass bolsters. I'm using a Oregon Blade Maker 2x72 belt sander. It's a fairly new machine for me. I absolutely love it. It's matched up with a 2 horsepower variable speed. It really does the job nicely. So these are the scales now. They're basically done, and I'm going to start attaching them to the handle of the blade. I use what we call the North Guard technique for mounting scales. And this comes in especially handy when you have brass bolsters, because you really want to get the scales or the handles matched up perfectly with those bolsters without any gap. So again, 2-part epoxy. I'm going to epoxy one side of the scales. I'm going to epoxy, the knife handle, the blade handle. Then I'm going to press those scales right up flush against the bolsters. I'm going to check and recheck to make sure that there's no gaps in between the bolster and the scale material. And then I'll put a couple clamps on that and just walk away from it until it's dry. Once it's dry, basically 1/2 of the handle is firmly attached to the blade. So then I'm going to go to a drill press, and I'm going to line up the 1/4 inch drill bit through the pre-existing holes in the handle, and then drill through the scales. And so basically you have 1/2 of the scales mounted perfectly to the bolsters, and you have holes through not only that half of the scale, but also through the handle of the blade. I just use a pin saw to cut out those handles now. You don't have to be perfect at this. We're going to do some finished grinding afterwards. Just rough it out. So 1/2 of the handle is mounted and drilled. Now I'm going to repeat that process. So I'm going to glue up the other side of the scales, glue up the leading edge, attach it to the blade. And on this one, especially because I've got a couple of angles on there, I really want to make sure that the red, white, and blue liners on one side match up perfectly with the red, white, and blue liners on the other. What I did was I ground down the scales on the top surface so that they matched the top surface of the blade, so that I could use that as a visual reference. I could see exactly where those liners were matched up. Then I'm going to push it forward so it's completely flush against the bolster, clamp it in position, couple clamps on there actually, and just walk away and let that dry. Now it seems like a long process, and certainly people have other techniques. This just works for me. Once that handle is dry, the glue is dry, I'm going to go back over to the drill press. I'm going to clamp the knife into position, lining up that 1/4 inch drill bit through the existing hole and through the existing hole in the blade, and then just finishing it off. So you really end up with pinholes that are perfectly aligned through both sides of the scales, as well as the tang of the knife. Back to the pin saw one more time to rough cut the other side of the handles. And you can see now that the handles are really starting to take shape. So I've got walnut, alumalite, which is the blue, and red, white, and blue liners. The last step in the assembly of the handles is just to add the pins. In this case, brass pins to match the brass bolsters. I'm going to glue those into position, again with the same 2-part epoxy, and walk away from that until it's dry. Once that's dry, you can basically finish these handles however you normally finish your scales. I always do a little bit of the rough grinding on the 2x72, especially grinding down those 1/4 inch brass pins. You know, make sure you wear a respirator whenever you're grinding, especially when you're grinding these casting resins. You can also use the belt sander to finish off that top edge to make sure that the bolsters and the tang of the knife and the scales are all kind of even. They all line up. Now for some of the inside angles, I always, my go-to little gadget is a disc grinder with a flap sanding wheel, or an angle grinder with a flap sanding wheel. I think this is an 80 grit, and it moves a lot of material very quickly. You do have to be careful with it. I actually use the same flap sanding wheel to start to rough form the handles, to add a little curvature, to break the edges. You have to be very careful. If you lean into this too much, you will definitely remove more material than you want to. You have to have a really light touch. Now, after using the disc grinder with that flap sanding wheel, I will go to a regular sander, and I'll sand usually with a 220 and a 320. Now, if it was just the walnut scales, that's all I'd have to do. Maybe a little bit of hand sanding, maybe with a 400. Because of the alumalite, because of the casting material, you really do want to sand, hand sand after this. And I think I did a 600, 1,000, and then a 2,000 grit paper. And while I was at it, I also did the exact same sanding on the brass bolsters and the brass pins. Because of the alumalite, I'm going to buff it with a a plastic polish. You can get this in an automotive store. You have to have a very light touch with the buffing also. You don't want to heat up that alumalite. You really just want to lightly polish it. And that's basically it. I will put links, on this video about carving the or shaping and putting together the karbix red, white, and blue flag handles. But this was the prototype that I had done, the proof of concept. You can see the stars embedded into that translucent blue alumalite. The actual finished product was not as good as the sample was. On the finished product, I couldn't see the stars through the one side because I had ground them away on the back side. And on the other side, some of the stars are actually sticking through the alumalite on the surface. So in hindsight, I would definitely recommend the red, white, and blue karbix handle material. It's much easier to work with, and the end result was really kind of spectacular. One of the best buoys that I've ever made. I added some spine etching of some additional stars. You do that the exact same way that you etch the blade. I hope you enjoyed the video, even though I goofed up a little bit. Please check us out on the web at DIYEasyCrafts.com. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'd also like to invite you to our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. Thank you very much.